You are interested in the unusual, the mysterious, the unexplainable. That is why you are here.
Well, that's interesting you mentioned that, because one thing I think about quite often is when my oldest boy was 5 years old, we were walking in our front yard and he stepped on a goat head. Okay, now a goat head, I don't mean the head of a goat. It's a little tiny thorny sticker. It's a little thorny seed that we call a goat head because it kind of looks like it. And he stepped on it. It hurt him. So he said to me, "Goat heads hurt. Why did God make goat heads?"
That's great.
But wow. Yeah, I mean, I thought, he's 5 years old. He just touched upon the problem of evil right there. Yeah, I mean, I realized, wow, I won't have to put him all the way through college so he can finally take a philosophy class and have a professor confront him with the problem of evil. And I was thrilled at that moment because as a Jewish dad, I realized how much money I had just saved.
Well, it's incredibly apropos, archetypal now, because it was the head of a goat that showed your son evil.
And so, one thing I explained to him is, look, you blame God, right? You say, well, how could God have created this? Because it affected you personally. The fact is that plant wasn't interested, anthropomorphizing the plant now. The plant isn't interested in hurting you, but it produces these thorny seeds, so they get stuck on a human or animal that walks by, and then it falls off down the lawn somewhere, and the new plant can grow, and it doesn't have to compete for resources with the parent plant. And so it's a good thing for the plant. You just consider it evil because it affected you personally, because you interpreted it as a painful experience and you didn't like it. So even in there's a way to look at it. And so the problem with the atheist view is they also have a problem of evil. Everybody has a problem of evil, because if I decide I'm going to reject God's existence because of the problem of evil, then I look around the world and I would notice what? The same thing still happen. And now I won't even have God to blame anymore. So what have I really gained? The only thing I've gained is that I'm either going to, on the surface, tell myself that evil is
it's good.
No longer exists. It's not a real category. It's just perception. Or I'm going to tell myself that evil is good.
Yeah. Yeah, because we can't exist without meaning. We have to fill. If we create a void, we're going to fill it.
That's right. Right. That's the one thing I often tell people when myself and other people who are interested in discussing movies in terms of real life philosophy. And some people inevitably say, "Oh, it's just a movie. Come on, it's just a movie." It's like, well, but people, by necessity, they write some level of their own real life worldview experiences into their fictional movies. They have to. How could you not? I mean, if you didn't, your movie would be so abstract that it would literally be meaningless, and that meaninglessness would be its own meaning, so it would still be meaningful. And so if you try to write a movie, let's say, that's completely nihilistic, well, then the point of it would be nihilism, so it would still have meaning. You can't get away.
Right. You can only say that life is meaningful. You can never say that life is meaningless, because then that statement becomes meaningless.
That's right. That would be the meaning. It's like there's an old song by the band Rush where they say, "If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice."
Yeah. Well, I wanted to share one last insight I've had while I'm talking, and I'll just put it to you as a question, maybe just to think about, because you can answer if you want, but bringing it back to demons, it occurred to me throughout the last part of this conversation that perhaps if demons, they have to believe in God. They can't ever not believe in God because they know, but is it possible that demons are not able to believe in God's love?
Oh, is a very interesting way to phrase definitely a unique question.
Yeah, I don't require an answer. I just thought it was worth putting out there because it's definitely one that has caused me to think. And I mean, the whole question, whenever I hear about demons, I feel bad for them. That's just my nature. And if we're going to say that demons are demons because they've turned away from God's love or they've rejected the Redeemer, then we're saying that they have choice. And if they have choice, then they must have the choice to repent. So redemption must be available to them some way.
Wait, you don't have to go. I can't do this alone. She's too young to be left with only me. I'm tired of asking you why. The time was never right. Tell me where you are. You've already gone too far.
So, yeah, this is definitely a question worthy to be mulled over for a considerable amount of time. So I'll just mention a couple things that come off the top of my head. And one is that as I researched the book that I have yet to publish in the series, which will be What Does the Bible Say About Satan? And I recall hearing every now and then people talking about Satan in terms of, well, think about what it's like to be very angry, and you would do rash things, and if you're so angry, all this stuff. And I thought, that's not quite filling the picture for me. And then I thought in terms of, like, you have criminal profilers, right, where you hear about some horrendous crime and you think, how could anybody ever do that? Well, the criminal profiler will attempt to place themselves in the mindset of that person to understand why did they do the things they do. In fact, I think that your book, Prisoner of Infinity, is very much in that genre of placing yourself in the position of Strieber and Castaneda and others and saying, let me try to figure out why they're doing and saying the things that they're doing and saying.
That's great.
That's what I think, For me, I was very pleased to read a book from that perspective because it is somewhat unusual for me in that I don't have a background in psychology or psychiatry and mystical alchemy or whatever you want to call it. So that was very interesting to hear your perspective on that, but let me not get lost in that. So I started thinking about Satan in terms of insanity. Okay, so what would it be like to be not just angry, but more like insane? And I'm not claiming he's insane. I'm saying that helped me to figure out more of why does he do the things he does? And thinking of him in terms of insanity definitely helped. And so one thing I remember, G.K. Chesterton, and I'll have to paraphrase very loosely, but he said, when you talk to an insane person, you'd think that their thoughts would be completely disjointed and convoluted and all over the place. And he says they're not. They're deeply rational. And that's the problem. That's what makes them insane, is that they can pull everything together, right? Things that really don't belong together, they can manage to pull them together. And that's what makes them insane. And so you find, for example, something that has been said a million times is Satan has not had an original idea in millennia. And I chime in and say, and the worst part is he hasn't had to, because we keep falling for the same old thing. So let me throw in a slight bit of background on him and then get back to your question is, one thing that we're told about why Satan fell is because he thought in his mind, I will be like God. I will be like the Most High. I'm going to be above and beyond God. In other words, I'm going to supplant God. Well, he takes that, what I call the original rebellion. He takes that basic thought and he introduces it to Eve. You will be like God, right? And let me say, there's a good way and a bad way to be like God, right? We should be like God in terms of holiness and grace and forgiveness and all that. But there's a bad way to be like God when you're actually seeking to usurp God and you're trying to make yourself God. And so everything Satan does is a copy but corrupt version of what God does. It's what God does, but inside out, upside down, and backwards. This is why you end up with things such as Gnosticism, where it's literally taking the story of Eden and turning it inside out so that God becomes evil and Satan becomes the illuminator, the good guy, right? The Prometheus. Yeah. It's a complete reversal role. So thinking in terms of insanity definitely helped me make sense of Satan. And so maybe it's an issue of angels fell knowing full well God's existence and nature and character, and that's what makes their sin unredeemable, is that it was based on perfect knowledge. It was just an act of will to rebel. It wasn't, oops, I wasn't aware, or gee, I didn't really know. It was about I'm doing this for my own reasons, which go against what I know to be God's will.
But something must have happened then, because they were created by God in God's image, so something went wrong there, so that still leaves unanswered. Like, how could something evil come out of something good?
Yeah, it could be that they were created in God's image. I mean, we're not told that, but it might be the case. I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that. I just want to point out that we're not specifically told anything like that about them. So yeah, there was some event that in which Satan took a part, and that which caused this fall. And incidentally, I do not want to sidetrack us into another rabbit hole, but I'll just mention that there's a lot of people involved in research pertaining to Nephilim and quote-unquote giants, and that field of research, by the way, is absolutely saturated in misinformation. It's overwhelming, the amount of errors that are in that field. But I'm just mentioning that because it seems to be the case that Satan himself personally fell, and the event recorded in Genesis 3, where when he approaches Eve in the garden. Later on, he does something to get a third of the angels to fall. Okay, that's what's recorded in Revelation 12, and the event itself is related in Genesis 6, because Revelation 12 envisions Satan as a dragon whose tail sweeps a third of the stars from the sky and they fall to earth. And that's biblically verifiable symbolism, obviously, for Satan somehow having something to do with causing the fall of a third of the angels. So whether that means that they decided to worship him, whether they decided to somehow side with him rather than God, I would have to be inventing a way to connect two puzzle pieces that aren't very specifically connected for us. But it does seem to be a matter of that for some reason or another they made a choice. They made it knowingly, willfully, and wantingly, and that's why there's just no redemption for them. But
if there's no redemption, then they're not evil. That's my point. If they don't have any choice about being the way they are, then they can't be held accountable for it.
Right. The choice they had is in becoming the way they were, in becoming what they became. That's where
So they made a choice not to have a choice.
Well, they made a choice to solidify a choice that could never be taken back.
But why is it important to believe that? Because I don't believe that. I don't believe. I think it's like trauma. I think it's like when something traumatic happens, we get locked into compulsive unconscious behaviors. So it feels like we can't ever go back. But there is always the possibility, until there isn't, of course, until we die, of surrendering. There's always the option of surrendering. So my sense is the idea is that there's no redemption for the evildoer is an idea that the evildoer himself has, and that's what causes them to persist in evil. Whereas God, by definition, is all forgiving, all redeeming. Like a redeemer who can't redeem everything is a limited redeemer. His power is limited, and I don't understand God that way, or Christ. I understand them as being infinite in power to redeem everything.
Right. I think that, okay, so I think that you would obviously get into at least two different theological perspectives. Right. One would be that the reason he does not redeem them is because they do not want to be redeemed. Yeah. They've made their choice, and let's talk in terms of hell, which is a word I see. Okay, so in short, again, I have wrote this in the books, but in short, hell is a word that really describes what the Bible actually terms the second death, aka the lake of fire. So if you think of, well, is that an eternal state of being? The answer is yes. And why? Because apparently hell would be eternal because sin is eternal. Because the person who has chosen to not repent has chosen sin. And so it has to be eternal because they've chosen to hold on to their sin for all eternity. And it's more a case of, in this theological point of view, God basically thinking, well, if you have chosen against me and you've chosen to hold on to your sin, then you're going to hold on to it for all eternity because that's what you want.
So that's one. What's the other? What's the second one?
Well, the other would be more what comes out of a Reform or Calvinistic perspective, which would be that God, from eternity past, purposefully created beings and people that would be condemned.
Well, I don't think I ascribe to either one then. It seems like. Because as I say, to me, it's like that old the children's thing, if God's omnipotent, can he create a rock so heavy he can't lift it? So that's similar to what you're saying, that he can create creatures that even though he has the power to redeem everything, he can't redeem these creatures because he created them not to be redeemable, right? So,
well, then let's take a step back. Okay, biblically speaking, is it a fact that God can do anything and everything?
I don't know if you're asking me to answer that or not. I thought it was rhetorical.
Oh, I know there's rhetorical questions, but are there rhetorical answers? Okay, so biblically speaking, it is not the fact that God can do anything and everything, because God is holy, so he will not do anything that violates his holiness. For example, the Bible tells us God cannot lie. Okay, so can God create a rock so heavy he can lift? He couldn't do that because it violates an aspect of his nature, which is that he's a volitional being with a mind in which logic is embedded.
And compassion also. Love
What's
also.
That?
More, even before logic, I'd say that love is embedded in God's action. God cannot act without love.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's another extremely important thing. And let me just quickly say, I debated an atheist at a university on the issue of morality. And what I argued is that the best premise for morality, and really I was debating ethics or objective morality or universal morality because you can get confused by these terms, but I said the best premise is the triune God, because why? because this means that it is a essential part of God's very being, of his ontology, that he is a relational being and has been so for all eternity. And now this relationship is diverse because it is experienced amongst the persons in the Godhead, but it is also perfectly unified because God is one. And so you're right. That is job one in God, is that by nature and essence, he's a relational being. And so God didn't create human beings because he was lonely and had nobody with whom to have a relationship. No, he already had that. He created us in order to expand and expose and share his love. But yeah, the issue of can God do this, can God do that, can he make a square circle? Well, if God created a square circle, it would violate what we know of as a square and a circle. And so that's logically impossible, so God wouldn't
So
do
yeah,
it.
I would say that the square circle in this conversation is hell. That God can't create hell because God's acts are acts of love. But God's creation can create hell, like a secondary creation.
Well, actually, I understand what you're saying. The Bible, you'll find it's interesting. It specifies that hell was created for the devil and his angels.
So maybe they created it for themselves.
I could see a way of looking at it where the result would be that their action.
That's the end of my conversation with Ken Ammi. Find out more about Ken by following the link in the show notes. This is Jasun Horsley once again for the Liminalist podcast between at horticulture.com for Halloween 2018. If you'd like to support this podcast, if you'd like to support this podcast, please do so. You can donate one-time or regular donations via PayPal in the widget bar at the website, or you can buy my books. Or if you'd like to consult with me about applied liminality, living in liminal times, I am offering one-to-one consultations at this time. The first consultation is free of charge. It's not therapy per se. Well, it's just what you could imagine or intuit it might be from listening to these conversations on the podcast, albeit in a much more personal and intimate and specific